I want to start off with impeachment. And first, I want to thank you for being on the show because more Americans, more of America should know who you are, because you are one of the most prominent criminal defense attorneys in the country. You're a civil rights attorney. Your op-eds are absolutely incredible. They're, in fact, the easiest to read that I've ever read. I see them all the time, Jerusalem Post. You've written for SaraCarter.com. So thank you for taking some time out of your busy, hectic schedule to come on the show. But I want to start right up off at the top. Impeachment, what we've been through as a country. Now with the Senate trial, of course, now no witnesses, but you have your own thoughts on that. And I want you to talk a little bit about how this was handled, what happened during the Senate trial, and where do we go from here?
Okay, thank you very much. And first of all, it's a huge honor for me to be on your show. Listen, I think that because the impeachment grounds were such a farce, I think a win in the Senate should have been a foregone conclusion from the start. So that gives the lawyers a great deal of flexibility. And I think they did a fine job. But I think the idea of no witnesses is absolutely right. But I think that they didn't lay the groundwork for that sufficiently. So that's why we have people now given some credibility to argue that the American public was cheated because there were no witnesses. There shouldn't have had to have been witnesses for a number of reasons. I think personally that the defense team made a mistake in sort of weaseling around at the beginning. By that I mean saying, well, listen, the House managers have the burden of proof, and there were no eyewitnesses to the conversation. I think that's complete nonsense. I think that based on all of the facts that we know about the reason for the president's call, and given even the worst case scenario of how that's been construed, the president absolutely had an obligation to condition any aid to the Ukraine on a full investigation into corruption, and the corruption that he knew about from credible sources, not just political people. He knew about them from the media. He knew about it from the Wall Street Journal articles that had reported the corruption involving Hunter Biden, and not just Hunter Biden. Hunter Biden's partner, Devin Archer, John Kerry's son, of course, Chris Hines, had been partners with them both. He apparently stepped out of this Burisma deal because he was so concerned about how it looked. So I think that the president had an obligation to require the Ukraine to investigate. The fact that the subject of that investigation may have been a candidate for president doesn't eliminate that responsibility for the president. The president's talking about giving away a tremendous amount of millions of dollars in U.S. aid. He has credible charges of corruption. Demand corruption reform before they get the money.
Let's talk about that, David, because you brought up such a great point. I don't want to forget, because I need to ask you this question. Quid pro quo. I mean, if you think about it in the scheme of things from the very beginning, from past presidents all the way to the Marshall Plan, it's always been, we'll give you aid conditional upon this. Because it's always about putting America's interests first. I know you wrote about this. Can you explain a little bit about that so our listeners, our readers understand what this means and what the Marshall Plan did and why this is just a part of our foreign policy when we give aid to a foreign nation?
Sure, and you make a great point. It's a very important point, Sarah. And I think every American ought to agree with this. Our money is very precious and very valuable. We should be giving money where it supports our interests abroad, and only in those circumstances. And therefore, there's always a quid pro quo. That's why I've thought from the start here, some of the commentators have been misguided in buying into this idea that Congress raised. Well, there was a quid pro quo. Therefore, he gave something. He was withholding this aid to get something of value. That's always the case, and it should be. There is study after study on a related issue here that the United Nations has done and that private groups have done to show the corrupting effect that giving money without having guidelines on corruption has. That is, when we give money to a corrupt regime or a regime that refuses to investigate corruption, we're just exacerbating the problem. We're giving this. Let's take, some country where it's run, a family run for generations. We give aid to that country. It happens all of the time that aid just never gets past the family, never gets past the corruption, never gets to its intended recipients.
Well, the UN, the United Nations actually has done studies on this, where you can see that a significant amount of aid that the United States gives to other nations, a lot of them, corrupt nations, never reaches its intended target.
That's exactly right. So I would love to hear a credible argument here to say that the President of the United States has given information that there has been a corrupt relationship between the Ukraine and the previous administration, the Obama administration, and that that corruption marked some significant issues. The President of the United States, given that information, should he ever say to the Ukraine, listen, we're going to overlook the corruption that I've heard about, and we're just going to continue pouring money into you? Of course not. That's not in American interest. It's not in international interest. And so I thought the president's team should have taken that tact from the beginning, because it's an important message to send. And it eliminates all of this nonsense about what this eyewitness heard, or even now what, John Bolton, who had been, a good friend of mine. I sat on a panel with John Bolton before. I don't understand where this is coming from now, but putting all of that aside, it doesn't matter whether the president spoke to John Bolton about withholding aid unless there's an investigation. There should have been an investigation. Of course, frankly, there still should be an investigation. And, as I've said from the start, Joe Biden should be the first one calling for an investigation if he or his son did nothing wrong. And, of course, we do have some evidence now that there was something going on. I mean, we have Joe Biden on video. You can see it on YouTube, bragging about withholding aid until the prosecutor was fired. So they say, well, it wasn't related to his son's investigation. It clearly was the same prosecutor who had earlier investigated Burisma. Anyway.
Well, let me ask you this, because I think this is so important right now. And I want to go to this point, because they're going to argue, and this is the Democrats, and this is what they've been arguing, is that you're trying to involve a foreign country in a U.S. election. But let's not forget that it was Hillary Clinton and the DNC that actually paid for a dossier that was compiled by a former British spy, Christopher Steele, who worked for MI6, whose sources, by the way, have never been really verified. There was no Woods procedure done. This is when they spied on Carter Page. They did this to target President Trump. And some of those sources we know, based on Christopher Steele's own admission, were Russians. So they basically paid Christopher Steele, a former British spy, to collect disinformation from former Russian spies to target a U.S. candidate. And now they're saying that investigating an actual, real, possible corruption issue here is involving a foreign country. Can you explain that so that we can all understand what's going on here?
The easy answer to that is no, I cannot, except to say that it reflects the greatest hypocrisy that I've seen on a public interest issue. I will also say this. There is no human being on the face of the earth who has more exhaustively and accurately reported this and investigated it than you. So you know what you're talking about, and you've just laid out that the side of the equation that shows the hypocrisy. I'll go on the other side of the equation. I've seen recently, some of these House managers, again, hypocritically saying, well, we don't involve foreign governments in our election. How about our government interfering with other governments? I don't think we have ever seen the interference to the degree we saw by Presidents Clinton and Obama in the Israeli government's election.
Explain, because this is so important, and people really need to understand this. There was direct involvement by the U.S. State Department in the elections in Israel. And a lot of people don't want to talk about this, but this is just fact.
That's right. That wasn't the only example. I mean, they've done it in many African nations forever. That's been, some people have said it part of our foreign policy. But in the case of Israel, Mr. Clinton made clear, and Mr. Obama made clear, along with John Kerry, that they did not want Prime Minister Netanyahu in office. They did everything they could, including sending their own consultants in to help the opposition, putting out public statements that would undermine the Netanyahu government. That was clear and direct interference. And then, of course, the UN Resolution 2334 that Kerry and Obama supported at the end of the Obama administration was just abhorrent to any sense of decency. So those two administrations interfered directly in Israeli democracy, one of the great democracies in the world, frankly. So it's completely hypocritical for Schiff or any of these others to say, sort of a holier-than-thou position, we don't interfere. But again, calling what the president did here an attempt to interfere with the election is simply misconstruing the facts. That's not fair. It's characterizing the facts because the person who is involved in the alleged corruption happens to be a potential candidate for president. But what he did here was, if it's accurate, and based on the transcript, he certainly seemed to have insisted that there be an investigation into corruption. And by the way, the other part of that seems to be lost in this discussion is that the president asked for an investigation, not a prosecution, not a Mueller-type agenda-driven witch hunt, that sort of thing, an investigation. And however it came out, the president was willing to accept those results. But again, that's why I say Joe Biden should be demanding it to clear his name. The president didn't tarnish Joe Biden's name in this. The newspapers reported this long before Mr. Trump came into office.
Well, and we even see that now with the ABC News report when they interviewed Hunter Biden. They specifically asked him, are you, if you would you have had this position on the Burisma board if you weren't a Biden? And basically what he said was, no, I don't think so. My name carried that kind of weight. And it doesn't mean, now I'm not saying that it's illegal. What I'm saying is that there's an ethical issue here when your father's the vice president in charge of Ukraine policy for the Obama administration, and you're getting paid hundreds of thousands of dollars. $60,000 a month is what they were estimating he was making. Now, to sit on boards. And why else would Burisma want Hunter Biden on their board, if not to create a shield from investigations? Once you have the president's, vice president's son on board, that's what you got. You got a shield.
And as you say, there may or may not have been something illegal about it, but don't the American public deserve to know what's happening with their taxpayer dollars, what's happening with their government? And shouldn't it be before the election? I mean, you don't want to find out after the election, Joe Biden did this, Joe Biden did that. Joe Biden should want his name cleared, or the American people should demand to know just what happened. Are they getting an honest person that they may be voting for, or someone who was, just played that game? And isn't this what Drain the Swamp was about, exposing this kind of thing? We still don't know what, if any, role President Obama played in this.
Right.
Did he just turn a blind eye when his Ukraine representative, the vice president, was dealing with these issues? We don't know, but we deserve to find out.
And they don't want us to find out. I was going to ask you, you would have had your own witness list. Had you been representing the president, had you been able to be a part of this, who would have been the witnesses you would have called? Just out of curiosity.
What I really say, I put that list out there to say two things. One, I don't think there needed to be witnesses called in this case. But if there were witnesses called, what the Democrats, these House managers, ought to recognize is the most material witnesses are the very witnesses I don't think, ever want us to hear from. And those are people like Joe Biden, Hunter Biden, Devin Archer, Chris Hines, John Kerry's son-in-law, who at the time was partners with these folks in it. But I also would have called, for sure, Schiff. I mean, Schiff is a material witness both into the so-called investigation, the dealings with the whistleblower, and the integrity of the process. I would have called Nadler also. Nadler hired as they became sort of, special counsel to his committee in the end. But these two guys, Eisen and Burke, who on taxpayer dollars are supposed to be, investigative counsel for this public committee in Congress, they both wrote a treatise together, trying and sentencing, convicting and sentencing the president on obstruction of justice a long time ago. It's a 168 treatise they wrote. Both of them have lawsuits on behalf of an organization going against the president under the emoluments clause. What kind of objective investigators are these? That goes to the heart of the integrity of the process. I think after all of the millions of dollars that have been spent on this
so important.
Circus, we need to find out, how were they put in those positions? Expose it at least.
You're right. I forgot about the emoluments clause lawsuit. A lot of Americans have, because we've been so bombarded with so many different reasons from the Democrats as to why President Trump should be impeached. It's like one thing after another. He's constantly having to dodge away from their constant attacks on him. And I'm talking about President Trump. You also brought up Schiff. I think that's really an important point. He is a material witness in this. We know that based on all of the evidence that's out there, that Adam Schiff's committee met with this whistleblower before he even turned the report in to Inspector General Michael Atkinson. So So what was going on there? And we don't even know the truth about what was going on there.
Right, and you put your finger on something a second ago, and you say all of these various grounds. Let's face it, this is all political, the worst kinds of politics. They made up their mind when Donald Trump was elected that they would do whatever it could take to get rid of him. And they made a big mistake. I mean, Alan Dershowitz said it, they picked the wrong grounds. Again, I wish he had been a bit stronger in some of the things. I don't like this waffling around, being an apologist on the one hand, and even if he did something wrong as under crime, I don't think in this case that applies. He didn't do anything wrong, in my view. But they were just looking for something, and I don't know that it'll stop here at all. But it's a terrible thing for the American people, it seems to me. I just wish the Congress could get to the business of policy.
Oh, don't you? I do too. I mean, this is what they're there for. They're supposed to be there to vest themselves in issues that American people care about, like healthcare or, or criminal justice, our education system. And they're not doing any of it because they're so focused on targeting President Trump that it's as if they forgot that they were representing the American people. I wanted to jump really quick because I know you have a lot of thoughts on this, but President Trump's deal of the century, right? So between Palestinian leadership and the Israeli state, what are your thoughts on that? And certainly we're seeing that Palestinian leadership is rejecting it outright, even before it was even released. And I know that's something that you're very adamant about is like, we got to look at this Palestinian leadership and see what they're actually doing to our people.
Yeah, so I've spent a lot of time representing American victims of terrorism, and primarily terrorism by the PLO and the Palestinian Authority run groups, including other factions that are part of their executive committee and so on. So I feel very strongly about this issue. What the president presented here is truly extraordinary. Not to say that everyone should agree with every part of it. I don't like the idea of turning over any Israeli villages to what I believe will be another terrorist regime. But put all that aside, the president came up with what he believed to be the most practical and fair-minded resolution here. And it's been rejected, as you say, outright by the Palestinians. But remember, their whole course is, Zava Eban said, they've never missed an opportunity to miss an opportunity, but it's much worse than that. Their response to everything is violence and the threat of violence. That can never be a negotiating partner. Those who know it well would say the creation of a Palestinian state, certainly today, would be nothing more than the creation of another terrorist state. We saw it when Israel unilaterally gave up to Gaza. Hamas created a terrorist state there. You see now what the president has done here, an incredible accomplishment, and cannot be lost, shouldn't be lost in the discussion. Coalescing the other Arab countries now to support something like this that recognizes the Israeli state as a Jewish state. It's a real talking piece. What is it? What are the onerous parts of it to the Palestinians that they object to so much? Disarming. A disarmed state was part of the Oslo Agreement. They were never to be permitted to be an armed state. Good luck. I mean, they're not going to be able to disarm Hamas. We see now reports in today's news that Iran is joining with Hamas and Islamic Jihad to, again, threaten death to Israel, death to the United States, and all of that. The president has come through with a remarkable proposal here that really deserves, we see these pundits, people who have been Mideast negotiators in the past saying, oh, it's a non-starter. They never succeeded. This is the one field in the world in which people are held out as experts, Middle East experts that have been wrong every single time. The president's trying a new approach. We certainly need a new approach.
Do you think, David, this is the Palestinian Authority is not, they don't even care about their own people, really? I mean, it's all about them and what they want, because it appears that they don't want a real two-state solution. They don't want to even recognize the state of Israel. Do you think if there were different leaders, that the Palestinian people themselves may be different, maybe approach this differently? Or how do you think, I guess what I'm trying to say is it the leadership or is it the leadership and the people?
Well, it's a great question. It's the leadership. I believe the average Palestinian person who has generally interacted with Israelis as neighbors and in commerce well before Oslo could get along great. By the way, you see most Palestinian Arabs who are Israeli citizens don't want to give up their Israeli citizenship to come under the regime of an Abbas or somebody else like him. But the part of the problem is, for decades now, the Palestinian Authority and before them the PLO, and with the tacit approval of the UN, the relief agency that operates there, has been educating the young people to hate Israel and the United States and the West, and to commit themselves to violence for decades.
But they will ask the children of the Palestinian children to commit themselves to violence. They tout, suicide attacks when it comes to the children or the poor or the Palestinian people that are living there, but they themselves would never do that. They're living in $1 million homes in Qatar,
100%.
in Beirut, and running operations with impunity. Right?
That's right. And in Judea and Samaria, which they control a good part of now. We hear about all this poverty, but you know it very well. If you were to travel in those places, as I often do, you see mansions that the leaders and the people with money own, and then we just hear about poverty. You don't see the leader of Hamas sending his son into a suicide bombing.
And it's always like that. And I want the listeners to really understand, because David spends a lot of time in Israel. I've spent a lot of time in Afghanistan, in the Middle East, in Iraq. It's always this way. The leadership of Al-Qaeda, these groups, they don't have any problem. Hamas, Hezbollah, they don't have any problem sending children and people in poverty or people that they've recruited and brainwashed into these suicide attacks, but they themselves would never do it. They would never do it. They live like kings. They live like kings in mansions and beautiful homes. They dictate from their ivory towers what their people should do, and they cause corruption and strife and war. Endless war, and they target Americans, they target Jews, they target anybody that's in their path, Europeans, whatever. This is about ending the state of Israel, people. That's what they're about.
100%. You're 100% right, and I'm so glad to hear you saying it. And that's one thing this president has done, has brought some honesty to the picture. We've had all of this mealy-mouthed moral equivalence talk in past administrations. There is a right and a wrong here. It is wrong, as a matter of law and morality, to use children as human shields.
Exactly.
Only one side does that. Only the Palestinians do that. The Israelis do not. They value human life. So all those kinds of things, this president has cut all new ground in what he's done, recognizing Jerusalem as the capital of Jewish people. I mean, all of these kinds of things, while under constant attack. The president of the United States deserves tremendous amount of credit.
Well, before I move on to Roger Stone, because I know I really want to talk to you about this. It's very important to me, and I think to our listeners, what's happening now with Roger Stone. But I want to lay one thing out. President Trump did something remarkable with this deal of the century. And David, you brought it up over and over again in your statements, but I want to lay it out. He laid out, basically, here's an opportunity for real change. Here's your chance to have your own state. We have Israel now on board with this. So he's put it out there. He put the ball in their court. This is what you wanted. This is what you've asked for. The ball is now in your court. This is what you can do for your people. This is a stepping stone for negotiations. So if the Palestinian Authority refuses to negotiate, refuses to take that first step, that just tells you straight out where they're coming from. And maybe the Palestinian people, maybe it's time for them to find new leadership. Anyways, Mahmoud Abbas has really done no service to the Palestinian people. He's done absolutely nothing for them but cause more and more problems. And, that's coming from somebody who has traveled through the region, who sees what's happening there. Maybe my opinion, but Mahmoud Abbas has taken advantage of his position with the Palestinian Authority, and he's maybe somebody we shouldn't even be negotiating with anyways. And I want to move to Roger Stone. Right. I want to move to Roger Stone because this is so important. Specifically right now, Stone was convicted of lying to Congress, right? Lying to Congress. By the way, I can't even begin to tell you how many people we have reviewed congressional testimony. How many people have lied to Congress? James Clapper, John Brennan, all of these folks. When Roger Stone's home was raided in Florida, and I spoke to Roger Stone after this happened, But when all that armada swept in, David, that armada of men with weapons and people on the water and boats and these heavy vehicles, for this poor older man is sleeping in his bed, with his wife and gets this crazy knock on the door, and his wife has a hearing issue. She didn't even know what was going on, and they had guns pointed at him. We could see the video footage online. Just go online. Tell me a little bit, as a defense attorney, what went through your mind? Oh, and by the way, CNN was already there, so the FBI tipped off CNN so that they could be there and make a spectacle of this, which I believe was an intimidation tactic for anybody at the time that was around President Trump.
Of course it was. This should be abhorrent to every single American and should scare every American to death what happened here. Because, it may be that Roger Stone was today's target with this. It could be anybody if we don't speak up against this kind of thing. There's no violence charged here. He was treated as if he were a Mexican cartel lord or something like that.
Right.
There's absolutely no justification for the type of raid that went on. This is a case with any other person, it would be handled like this. Call would be made to the lawyer. Listen, we've got an investigation going on, possibly an indictment coming. Mr. Stone like to turn himself in? Yes, absolutely. What time would you like me to have him brought to your office? Of course, he was released on a personal recognizance bond eventually, and then a $250,000 bond. But that's the way it would have been handled. Why did this happen, and why hasn't there been more outrage about it?
I know, but who approves this, David? Who approves this? Like for example, that's what went through my mind. It was like, wait a minute. When this went to the Justice Department, who said, okay, yeah, send the Armada in to get Roger Stone?
Well, all I can say is this. What we know is the matter was handled by the Mueller investigative team. What we know is a primary prosecutor in the case was Jeannie Rhee. Who was Jeannie Rhee? Jeannie Rhee, as you well know, was one of the lead prosecutors on the Mueller team. But before that, her credential was she represented Hillary Clinton in Hillary Clinton's own email scandal. How on earth do you have a person like that on the Mueller investigative team as a prosecutor and now prosecuting Roger Stone, who Hillary Clinton, hates his guts? It's all explained by that. This is, I've called it in the past, the Mueller-Weissman investigative team. That's what it was. We know now that Weissman was essentially running it. Jeannie Rhee is, one of a kind with him, just about. Maybe nobody's the same exactly as Weissman, but that's what it is. It was run by the Mueller team. But I'm going to tell you why you didn't hear so much outrage, because the judge in this case, who, other than this case, had some real credentials. She had been a criminal defense lawyer. She was a decent judge. But again, off the deep end, it seems in this case, put in place a gag order, terms of release, a gag order that prohibited Mr. Stone from discussing the case in any way in any public forum.
Right.
But not just Mr. Stone, any of his friends, any of his attorneys, they could never speak out against the Mueller investigation or the Mueller team. I've never heard of any such thing, nor could they go on social media, nor retweet anybody else's social posting about the case. To me, that restricted the lawyer's ability to defend the case. Today, for a criminal defense lawyer, you need social media to learn facts about a case, facts about witnesses. His lawyers were completely barred from any of that. I've never heard of such a thing.
I want you to say that again. David Schoen, who is one of the top criminal defense attorneys in this country, folks, top civil rights, top criminal defense attorney, has never heard of such a thing. David, it's like they weaponized everything. They weaponized everything from the Department of Justice to the FISA court, the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Court, with their warrant applications. They utilized the power of the agencies that we entrust to protect us. They utilized that to target what they saw as a political enemy, somebody that they wanted to remove, and they targeted everybody else around them. It really makes me question.
Just as scary as you make it. It's just as scary as you make it sound.
It is. And I know now, and I know I got to let you go because you've got so much going on today, but I know that there are people, the prosecutors actually, even people who testified for the prosecution. One person in particular who wrote this incredible letter I'm looking at right now, Randy Credico, who actually testified against Stone, is actually asking the judge to not give him any jail time.
That's right. The charges against Mr. Stone, the most serious charges, were the so-called intimidation or threats against Randy Credico. There's a long-time banter they had between each other. He's a public media figure and all that. Credico has made it clear to the judge that he never considered any of it to be taken as a real threat or intended as a threat, and that it would be a huge mistake to send Roger Stone to prison. And he's absolutely right. I want to, before we wrap, I know you're going to wrap up, Sarah, I want to say one thing to you just on the first subject that we touched on.
Yeah.
To me, one of the most telling things that we've heard in our American political system that ought to disqualify people like Jerry Nadler and Congressman Green from office is when they made statements in sum and substance saying they must proceed with the impeachment proceedings because essentially we can't trust the American people at the ballot box to do the right thing. That ought to be a call that every American hears. It's as anti-democratic a pitch for impeachment or for anything else that I have ever heard, and it ought to be taken as an insult to every American who values what he or she does in that ballot box.
I'm telling you, David, I thought the same thing. When I heard that, I was totally floored. How can a representative of the people, they have constituents, they were voted into office, basically say, you are not the American people. You are not smart enough. You can't pick your own president. You can't decide who should be duly elected. Let us do it for you. And now that you've done that, we're going to remove them from office. And that's how scary this is, that this really was on the edge. Could you imagine if the Senate was not more Republican than it was Democrat? If there were more Democrats on the Senate floor, just flip-flop it around. Yep. Could they have just impeached for political purposes? Yeah, maybe.
Absolutely. And would have convicted him in a second. Listen, you had Democratic senators were fighting over each other because the media reported that one of them was still open-minded. Of course they should have been open-minded, but they didn't want that to be out there to the constituency. They wanted him to have been convicted before they heard any evidence or any argument. No, it's terrible, but you've put your hand, you're the greatest. You're doing all of this reporting to bring these issues to the American public that's just not reported in other media, and certainly not sufficiently enough.
Well, you know, David, it's because I believe in our Constitution. I believe in our civil liberties. I think that's why I have so much respect for you, because you fight for those issues that people are not fighting for anymore. And I don't know if people realize that once you start giving up your rights, once you start cutting corners, and that's what people have been doing, and once you start giving up your basic moral line, right? That's what we saw with the FBI, with all of the malfeasance. We saw it in the DOJ. We've seen it in the NSA. We've seen it across the board. Once you stop holding people accountable, once you stop holding them accountable for the wrongs that they do, once you start cutting corners because you believe that's the right thing to do, I'm going to convict this person. I know they did it. I might not have evidence against them, or I don't like them. I'm just going to go out and convict them. Once you start doing that, you start breaking the fabric of our nation apart and what makes us so great. And that's what we're founded on. I keep telling people, it's not just about the land. It's not just about America. It's about those pieces of paper that are so powerful that we build our system on. But once you start throwing that away, you will have nothing left. You will literally, you're going to give up the greatest nation on earth in modern history right now. A very fragile young nation, right? Don't throw that away.
Well said.
Thank you so much, David. I'm going to bring you back on. There is so much that we need to talk about, especially issues related to Israel, which I know you've been so heavily vested in. Thank you again for being with me. You're the best.
You're the greatest. Thank you very much.